Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week we feature interviews with incredible poets, songwriters, and artists, including Olivia Gatwood, Safia El Hilo, Dana Joya, and many more. We also feature periodic submitted poetry episodes. Visit viewlesswings.com to submit your original poetry. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, and The Plague Doctor. Hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Threads at viewlesswings. Ariana Benson's poems appear or are forthcoming in Poetry, Poem a Day, Plowshares, Copper Nickel, and elsewhere. Recipient of the 2022 Furious Flower Poetry Prize, Benson serves as a nonfiction editor of Auburn Avenue Literary Journal. She lives in St. Louis, Missouri. Ariana, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, James. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to discuss your book, which I devoured, and then I devoured it a second time. So let's start with the challenge of titling and organizing collections. In the case of Black Pastoral, the title of the collection is also a poem that you'll share later that appears midway through the collection. And Black Pastoral is reworked by using bold-faced formatting to create three sections: Black Past, Black As, and Black Pastoral. For me, this framing of the book was really effective and intriguing, and I approached each section differently than if the sections had simply been numbered. How did you decide on this approach?
I'm so glad to hear that it was effective. First of all, that, it really kind of shaped the way that you engaged the sections, because that was really the goal. And then, of course, with Black Pastoral, it has a lot of meanings. It has kind of a double valence meaning of Black representing African-American history, but also Black representing a kind of darkness and even a kind of idea of a portal, right? We think of portals into a different, space often as Black. There's black holes. And so I felt like there were all these kind of meanings to Black. And so therefore I wanted to kind of give or find different spaces of meaning within the words Black Pastoral themselves. So Black Past is in there, and that's a part of Black Pastoral, right? The history of it. And then Black As, right? All these different things that Blackness can be and can look like, whether that's in an environmental context, whether that's in a cultural, societal context, right? And then Black Pastoral, the kind of last section, is all of those things coming together in a more kind of contemporary sense. So yeah, I really wanted to use the titles of each section not only to demonstrate all that is contained in Black Pastoral, but also demarcate some different themes and ideas that I'm hoping to identify in each section.
Well, it was very effective, and I thought that it really intrigued me right off the bat. So I thought that was a great choice. In Strange Fruit Market, you employed the villanelle form to, as called out in the notes, capture the contradictory histories of the pineapple, from a symbol of hospitality in colonial America to the role of the pineapple during the Middle Passage. The repeated and closing lines are, "A wild, strange fruit best served fresh and cold. Cut deep enough, black flesh turns to gold." I found the use of the villanelle form very effective, and closed forms like this are not as, I guess, in vogue right now, which I think is unfortunate because I think they can be very powerful. How did you approach choosing this form for the poem?
That's a great question. I wish I had an answer that was, I really thought this fit, or I worked with such intentionality. But you've identified the oldest poem in the book. That poem is the one poem that I wrote when I was still an undergrad. And I actually just wrote that poem because I had just been taught about the villanelle, fell in love with the form. And the content of it was inspired by my actual trip to Accra, Ghana. I studied abroad there for 2 weeks. And when we were walking to the Last Bath River, which is one of the places where, of course, the enslaved people took their last bath before heading to the ships, our guide pointed out wild pineapples along the path and said, they used to follow them and track them like you would use stars in the sky to track your location. And that always just really, really stuck to me. Then years on, I moved to the UK. And it's kind of interesting, especially in certain areas of London, there are pineapples on many little different banisters outside of buildings, right? The tops of buildings. It's very much a symbol of wealth. And I did more research and found that it was a symbol of colonial wealth, that one pineapple would cost thousands of dollars at a certain point in the UK because you couldn't grow them there. And so to have one meant your status was, kind of stamped, right? And so I found that connection fascinating. And I thought that villanelle was an interesting way to kind of bring those contexts together while talking about, the pure gold of the literal wealth of the pineapple, the pure gold of the direction and the kind of guide that it also was, and also the blackness being cut in both of those contexts, right? And I think one of my favorite things about the villanelle is that repetition, right? It's always coming back. And with a poem that is so heavily based on something that is a symbolic object, I thought it would be really interesting to repeat some of the words and see how the pineapple shifts context, how the gold and the black shift context throughout the poem.
No, I thought it was very effective, and I do encourage listeners to not be afraid of using more structured forms when it suits the poem, whether or not they're in vogue, because they'll be in vogue again. Trust me, things go around and around.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, many of the poems in this collection are anchored on research, as you just noted, of the slave trade and African American experience. I read the notes with interest and went down several rat holes, including reading more about the Great Dismal Swamp after reading your poem inspired by the subject. Your book, Kwaku Mbibola's book, Saltwater Demands a Psalm, who I interviewed last year, and others make me wonder if history should be taught using poetry. What are your thoughts on how poetry anchored in history can help build empathy and curiosity?
James, you have basically built my soapbox for me. This is my whole intention with writing these poems that are based in history. I do think that I should teach history using not just poetry, but various kind of more lyrical or humanistic mediums. And I say that because when you think about how history is broadly taught in the American educational landscape, it largely focuses on statistics, right? What did something, what happened literally? Where did it happen? How many people did it affect? When did it happen? What was the nation? And what that does is removes, to me, the human element of it. So we focus on, the what, the when, the where, and not the who of the literal people involved, the experience, what that did to the kind of one singular life of one of thousands of people who was affected. And I think particularly, of course, when we talk about Black history, slavery, history of the South, that crunching the numbers has a lot to do with not only dehumanizing or kind of minimizing what happened then, but also, how we understand its effect on people today, its effect on its descendants like me. And so if I can, through poetry, take one moment, one life in a grand kind of historical event, right, and explain to you what love happened in the field, what they had to think about, what an enslaved person might imagine when they thought their beloved had run away, right? The conflict between the guilt that they would feel and the grief, but also the relief that they might have escaped, right? Then we can kind of understand the gravity of these events beyond just we need to know them because we need to know history. And it really moves us, I think, more towards that if we don't know history, we're doomed to repeat it. So I'm hoping that through poetry, we can come to know history a bit better and not just, learn it. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, I think history books are so far away from the essence of what poetry is, and as a result makes the history boring and flat when history is fascinating and should come alive.
Absolutely. History used to be by far my least favorite subject in school. I hated it. I thought it was boring. I didn't understand why we had to learn it. But when I actually got to reading history, again, through art, I'm thinking specifically of Toni Morrison, of Zora Neale Hurston, right? Of people who framed history through a kind of artistic literature. And then when I went back and read about what these things were happening, I read people's personal narratives. I was like, oh, this is fascinating. Why did I hate this at all? And that's to say little of the fact that, again, my history, right, is taught a lot less than even, I think, American history, honestly, is taught a lot less than global history, or at least taught in a kind of very specifically and narrowly framed way. And so I'm hoping to expand the way that we think about and engage history as well.
Well, I recently interviewed Heather Bourbeau, who's a Californian poet, and she did a book, Monarch, which is about the history of the Western states,
Yeah.
and it's so powerful. I'm actually going to donate a bunch of copies to our local high school because I think it could really fit well inside a course when you're talking about Western history. It just brings it alive in a way where you want to go back, you want to go and explore more. That poetry can be a starting point as opposed to typical history book in high school makes you want to explore less.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I want to pique that curiosity for sure.
Well, your book is an excellent example of why reading poetry is best done on paper, in many cases, not in all cases, in physical form. You employ numerous visual forms, including several concrete poems, and one of my favorites is Self Portrait as Oil Spill, along with Elders Speak of Wind Chimes, a concrete list poem titled Things Tiny Enough to Fit Through Elmina's Door of No Return, and more. The form of your book even plays a role. It's square rather than rectangular, I'm assuming to provide more horizontal space for the layout. What is your approach to finding the visual form of a poem during the revision and editing process?
Yeah, I love that question. And it's interesting because I think actually for me, the form often is one of the last things I think about in the
Hmm.
form, in the poem. I usually draft in prose and then I break, the lines according to what I think the strongest enjambments would be. But with the poems that you've pointed out that kind of lean into the concreteness, I am thinking about the poem as object on the page, yes, but also I'm thinking about with a poem like Self Portrait as Oil Spill, right? With a poem like Elders Speak of the Wind Chimes, both of them employ and discuss extremely visceral events, right? An oil
Hmm.
spill drowning a lake, the lynching of Black people in Southern America, right? And so I'm thinking about how to best employ those images or really bring them home beyond just the literal words on the page. And I do think that using the shape form, the concrete form, might activate something in the brain to give you a little bit more of that image beyond just reading the words, right? And I think people, all kinds of people, we know that there are different styles of learning, right? There are visual learners, there are auditory learners, there are tactile learners. And so if I can, through poetry, engage more than just that first step of, okay, I read it and I heard the words in my head, the visual and even the tactile, then I think I can really kind of expand the audience a bit too.
And I think that your book, like Amanda Gorman's book, it really deserves to be read on paper, at least in part, and to hear it as well. I think it's two separate experiences. And in the case of Amanda Gorman's book as well, visually, it's so striking that it's part of the artistry, is how it's laid on the page. Yeah, so I think I encourage poets to experiment. If a poem's not working, maybe try to change the way it's visualized, and you go down a different path.
Absolutely. This is something that I learned from Eduardo C. Corral. It's one of my favorite pieces of advice. And he talks about how form is like a container for the poem, right? And I agree. And so he says, he pours the language of the form into different containers, the language of the poem into different containers. And so finding a container that looks the most full when you pour the poem into it, I think is the way to go.
I actually had two poems once that weren't working individually, but I liked some of the phrasing, and so I decomposed both of them, made a poem that was kind of very zen-y, and I had a little chime on my desk, and then I then formatted the poem to be sort of this zen, almost like sound
Oh,
wave. And then I had to rethink because I didn't want to cheat by stretching the lines. Like, how do I get it to
mhm.
work? And it took me down a path where I ended up with something so much better than the other two things that weren't
Yeah,
working.
yeah.
Well, consistent with pastoral being part of the title of your book, many of the poems draw inspiration from nature, but you also explore contradictions that make these poems more than simple pastorals. In the long poem Anti-Elegy for the Trees, you write, yes, it's true we need them, and I'll concede their beauty, but how I tire to, and sooner still of beauty, especially the kind we understand as needed. And in Anti-Pastoral, you write, so if I must admire the magpies, their morbid halo, you will look first, unflinching, at what festers in the brush. The saltating maggots, the feasting butterflies, their dripping wings. I wanted to read that just because it's really fun to read. In editing this collection, which has so much cohesion, how do you approach selecting poems that were consistent with the themes of the book and those to leave out, and the edits that you may have made once the book started to congeal? Many poets struggle with which poems to include in the collection and if or how they should change once you see the book coming together.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that was actually the most difficult part of kind of putting together a book, right? Is what to include, where to put it. I will say that once the idea came to me of that kind of black as, black past, black
Hmm.
pastoral, I was much better able to then kind of slot in which poems fit and which poems didn't. So I think both of those poems that you mentioned are in that second section, right? That black pastoral section. And so that section I think is most heavily focused on kind of deconstructing or demystifying this idea of the pastoral that has been, kind of uplifted substantially through poetry, right, throughout time, right? It's this kind of pristine field that's untouched, right? And it's beautiful in its nature and it's pure. But it also that others it, one, that separates it from us, from our world. It frames it as though humans are not nature, which is something that I don't agree with. And also it removes any kind of ugliness that might have been committed on that land. And of course, I'm a descendant of that. If you think about histories of indigenous people in this nation, right? And so we can't just blank slate, the kind of nature and the pastoral and then call that true. And so while there is beauty, I wanted to also attend to what festered under the brush, as the poem said. And so that was something that I was hoping to play with in those sections and kind of multiple sections. And I think that's true too. I didn't want to too tightly theme or categorize the poems between sections. I did want there to be a little bit of bleeding over. So maybe there are some poems that are more heavily pastoral that are in another section, or some that are more heavily kind of urban or contemporary focused that are in that black past section. But the themes bleeding through, I thought, made a little bit better of a through line. And initially, I think I had the poems arranged in chronological order. There are a
Hmm.
lot of epigraphs that have specific dates. But I also am finding myself more and more resistant to the idea of chronological time versus the idea of kind of, again, an experience, right? A kind of through line, through theme, through noticing, through images. And so I'm thinking of how poets might be able to consider how their poems take a journey just beyond the order in which they wrote them, the themes that they think they fit, and kind of imagine it as though you're writing like a symphony, and you're
Hmm.
hearing different notes play at different times, and it all comes together kind of to create a moment of music.
Well, Etymology of Mercy concludes with some of my favorite lines in the book. You write, "How kindly I ring rings of mercy into your throat. You who whittled the cross into a crude shiv, I christen forgiven, baptize breathless over and again. You who sate your crops with flesh-drawn rain, I wish nothing but misericord." Perhaps the lines of the poem just fell out of you. This has happened to me a couple times. More likely, you worked and worked and worked the lines to achieve the exquisite beauty in this poem. What is your approach to achieving beauty in poetry, which I think all poets are in this search for this beauty, this elegance, this just the right number of syllables, words, letters, everything. Well, what's your approach to kind of getting there?
Yeah, you definitely identified one of the poems that I had to kind of work and massage the most to get those lines perfect. Absolutely. And I think my approach to beauty actually does have to do more with the single line. I think for me, a poem that is strong as a whole and also has multiple lines that have various different meanings. And why I say that is because you can hold up a flower to someone, right? And a flower can mean love, a flower can mean friendship, a flower can mean grief and death. And so I love that there are all these kind of meanings in a universal symbol. I'm hoping to do that with individual lines. So to have a line in a poem about grief provide a moment of love. I think that's beauty, right? I think there's beauty in the conflict. I think there's beauty in the multiple emotional valences. And so for me, I'm often privileging that one line, that one moment
Hmm.
that might strike a different tone or a different chord than the rest of the poem. And in contributing to that kind of wholeness or fullness of emotion, I think that's where beauty comes from for me.
Beautiful. Well, a couple more questions before I hand the mic over to you. The collection includes a series of poems titled Love Poem in the Blackfield, and you're going to read one of them. This series of poems is noted in the foreword, Illuminate Love Under Duress. The poems made the broad historical context of your book personal. Talk about how these poems were developed and how you approached incorporating the poems into the book, which could have been combined into a single long poem. And by the way, after reading the book and rereading, I went back and read all of those in sequence, just as a
Uh,
collective. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much just for your careful reading of the book. These questions have been phenomenal. And I so appreciate that you read those in kind of sequence because I would love, honestly, I would have loved to just write an entire book of love poems in the Blackfield because I think those are so important. They're my favorite poems in the book because they're kind of doing an inverse work of, some of the work in the second section where it's taking something that we understand as beautiful and pointing out the ugliness in it. The field, obviously, because of, again, the histories of slavery, is a place that, for me, is often has these ugly, darker connotations, right? It's somewhere that we escaped. It's somewhere that we were oppressed. But naturally, there had to have been love in those Black fields, or else I wouldn't be here, right? Or else thousands of us, millions of us wouldn't be here. They were people who fell in love, who did experience joy, though few and far between, right? And in those moments, we're rising above that kind of just categorization of this was your role in history, you were enslaved, that's what we know about you, right? And so I wanted to bring those kind of moments of human tenderness and intrigue into the space of the field. And so that's what those poems mean to me. And then to kind of show them throughout time, because I also think that we don't necessarily think about how not even just slavery changed over several hundred years, but how Black experiences in America changed over several hundred years. And so by dating those and by placing them in different field locations, I'm trying to expand this idea or go beyond the idea that there was one singular field. There is field as concept, there is field as space, but there are so many different iterations of that, right? So that was also something that I hope to do with those poems.
Before turning the mic over to you, I'll pull one more line from the book. In a certain sickness, you write, maybe I carry animals in my pockets, and where you imagine I've tucked a barrel's nose lies instead the huffing muzzle of a beast untroubled by my flesh-warm dark. I read this particular poem over and over, finding so many different interpretations from gun violence to unconscious bias to more personal interpretations of inner struggle and dark thoughts. I come at this poem from a privileged perspective. What has surprised you about how readers and audiences have been impacted and interpreted your poetry?
Oh, I love that question. And I appreciate because I think with most readers, they are understanding the kind of things that I'm talking about, whether it's, gun violence, past violence of a kind of historical nature and how that's descended. And I think they're also picking up on the kind of implicit bias or the kind of broader things that I'm talking about, right, underneath the violence. But I will say, I think that something that I'm glad to hear you say is that you're also picking up on a kind of interior storminess or, a kind of interior unrest. And I think because the majority of the poems in this collection are not about me necessarily on the surface, right? I am not the speaker ostensibly. There are trees speaking. There are people from the past speaking. I think that has kind of made readers focus a bit more on those elements and not necessarily consider the ways in which that this book, I do think, is largely a book about self, about an individualized experience of all of the effects of these histories and these natures, these landscapes on an individual. And so even when I'm writing a love poem in the Blackfield, say about the one that's about Loving versus Virginia and Mildred Loving, right? Those things that are being spoken by Mildred Loving are things that could have easily been spoken by me, right? That kind of fear of being loved publicly, that kind of, what will this do if I allow myself to throw caution to the wind? Will I survive or will I perish under that light, right? And so I think I'm really, really grateful that you're kind of able to get at that third deepest layer of self-interrogation in this collection, because I did mostly want it to be an outward facing one. I did mostly want it to be about the world around and the world behind us and the world in front of us. But there are moments in there that are me kind of speaking through the voices of these characters that I've created or these characters that we know from history.
Well, now I'll turn the mic over to you to read selections from Black Pastoral.
All right, so this first poem I'll read is a prologue poem, and it's the first in the collection. And it depicts two enslaved people running away. And I think it was important to start with this act of running, not only because they're running away or from enslavement, but also questioning what we're running to, what we're running towards. And so this is the first poem, and it has an epigraph that reads, "Somewheres, some lifetimes ago." Prologue, love poem in the black field. I have run so far, so long. There is nowhere I haven't been but here, in this field, a body length from the ragged brink that gives way to forest. I collapsed here, the thin, hard slip of me whittled at both ends. I want badly to brave this aloneness now, as the hoofbeats swell like a whip welt around me, but I cannot. I weep for you. Clutch the hogweed, imagine it your wrist. Likewise, the stalks refuse to bend, even slightly, inside my balmy grasp. Oh, my saving grace, my heart's rest harrow, mere thought of you damns the plows that would have my head. When you arrive to pull me up from the mud, the salt will crumble from my eyes that for nights have seen nothing, save that cardinal north from which the stars beckon, those stars that, like you, never fade from sight, even in the day blue sky. Then for weeks, unspeaking, will follow their call, afraid to make more sound than does a mothling upon her first and final embrace with the open flame for which she confuses caged light. Such silence will we keep that all believe it is the river who thanks me for our crossing, and not you, for waiting for me, you'll whisper, as if I have done you a kindness, as if my life is not one that began only when we met, as if I had not been dead and waiting for you before. All right, the second poem I'll read is the title poem of the collection, Black Pastoral. There is a kind of poetry in a turning that leaves a body redder than before. Golden drupes ripen, orchards flush rouge. Sweetness curls the blades of leaves that once sprouted green. Fall confetti rains, red herrings in pretend surrender, showers of bleeding white flags. Yes, even the trees play possum when a cold force looms larger than they. They freeze, mine stone from wood, statue themselves like deer. Enter the fledgling buck. See him, just barely, a tawny smudge blinking back at you through the landscape's static. His molting crown, one shredded antler, a tree in its own visceral autumn, the other a felled trunk at rest in the ashen grass. Enter the black boy. See his boots leave little coffin prints in the ground, what lingers in the foam of his wake. They stand together, this boy, this deer, each a lone solstice removed from fawnhood, from his spring pink and summer blushed self, the memories of whom live only in the glossy black of the other's eyes. They reminisce for a moment in unblinking silence. Then see the boy's tiny hands, dotted with birch knot knuckles, his womb-smooth palms split along umber fault lines as they meet to cradle the lost horn and turn it upright in the frost, making sapling of skeleton. Now hear a distant whistling, a herd of cocked rods dragging like fingernails over the shivering ground, its goosebumped skin. See our subjects assume the position of hibernation, of stagnant and threatless sleep, praying they will awaken when the white recedes. They learned, in leaving the red of their mothers, the danger of hound-snouted men who, upon cornering a creature dark with life, ponder the taste of metal-peppered flesh. They know to freeze, to still their limbs, wait for the melt, for the trees to weep their winter out, the silent sobs a prelude to the red, not of end, but of moss, of possibility.
Wonderful. I love this portion of every one of these interviews where I get to hear the poetry read by the author. I learned so much about the poems just from that. How do you prepare a poem to be recited, and what role does speaking your poems out loud, even just in the mirror to yourself, play in the editing and revision process?
Oh, that's a great question. I've never been asked that before. I definitely think that the first thing I do usually after I have a draft that's kind of tightened into a semi-coherent form is read it aloud, because it lets you feel where the awkward portions are. And it also lets you feel if those line breaks that I've so meticulously created are really hitting, if I'm really able to pause at that moment, or if that's a line break that only exists on the page, which I'm okay with. But I need for there to be a few kind of surprising turns of the line that will only work when read aloud, when heard aloud as well, because I want the poem to live in both spaces. And also just figuring out how the sonics of the poem work, right? It's one thing to know that I've written an alliterative line or a line that uses a lot of assonance. It's another thing to read it out loud and to see, does this really flow smoothly? Or do these letters just look nice because they're being repeated on the page, but it isn't adding as much to the audio or the auditory kind of experience of the poem. So very much all of that is in play when I'm editing and writing and rewriting.
It's so interesting that reading in your head, even though it sounds like it would externally, it's so different, and it can be very misleading. Earlier in my poetry journey, I didn't read my poetry out loud. I didn't really perform it. It was just something I did for myself, and I'd send friends and family a poem occasionally. And then when a good friend nudged me to start publishing, and I knew that I had to really get experienced in reciting my poetry, I then incorporated reciting my poetry out loud as an editing tool. It's incredibly valuable. You just learn so much by actually speaking out loud, even if it's to just your cat, dog, or a mirror.
Absolutely.
Well, finally, what are you working on now?
Yes, that's a great question. So I have started actually to move kind of towards exploring different genres. And I think that's because I have a very specific, we've kind of talked, you've heard my spiel, a very specific purpose for writing poems, for what I want to explore, etc. But there are other things that I am obsessed with that I would love to explore and I think might be best explored through a different genre. For example, I'm a huge sports fan. I love television, film, different kinds of like video and digital media. I'm also obsessed with video games, right? I'm a huge anime fan. And so I think that just like poetry is this kind of very expansive genre that allows us to really hone in on small moments, the essay maybe allows us to kind of explore things that are a little bit less lyrically enticing, but still have a lot of intrigue, a lot of weight. It's also a place for me to maybe play a bit more with humor. So while I'm still writing poems, and I think the poems that I've been writing lately are also far more of them are in my own voice, far more of them are in me as the speaker. And I think that continued interior exploration, right, is necessary, especially after writing a book that, again, is so outward facing like Black Pastoral. But yeah, so looking in new genres and looking in new voices, if the new voice can be understood as my own voice, that's what I've been working on lately.
Very cool. Well, Ariana, thank you so much for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today.
Thank you so much, James. This is lovely.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at Viewless Wings. Hit subscribe to be notified of every episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast and spread the word with your poetry community.